Hello and welcome to The View from 22, a new programme from The Spectator where we take a different or original look at the week's news. I am joined today by Damian Reilly, who is a frequent contributor to The Spectator, and we're going to be talking about Dana, am I pronouncing that right?
Dana, yeah.
Dana White and the UFC. Now, Damian, explain for us a little bit about Dana White's latest escapades. He's been filmed slapping his wife in a nightclub, and you wrote a very good piece for The Spectator last week, saying, and I think most people agreed with you from what I could gather, that of course he has to go. It's not acceptable for Dana White to keep his job as head of the Ultimate Fighting Championship if he is publicly known to be a wife slapper. Is that a fair summary of what your piece was saying?
It's right. It's an extraordinary situation. This footage emerged on January the 2nd or 3rd, taken on New Year's Eve celebrations in a nightclub in Mexico. In it, you can see, it looks like he said something that's upset his wife. Then I think there's a bit of the footage is cut. Then you see him trying to talk to her, and she slaps him, and instinctively he just slaps her back across the face. So he strikes his wife. It's very obviously a very incendiary thing to happen. He has hit a woman, and yet he seems to be trying to style it out or keep his job. It seems an extraordinary turn of events for someone who hits women to remain in their job.
And tell us a bit about Dana White, because he's an extremely powerful figure in this world that probably a lot of our viewers don't know much about, but it is huge. It's mega business. It's an enormous sport all over the world. And Dana White is the king.
It's complete ultra-violence. It's wonderfully free of rules in a way. It's mixed martial arts, so it's all the different forms of martial arts in one fight. I think you can't eye gouge or bite or headbutt, but other than that, kind of anything goes. It's incredibly violent. There's no two ways about it.
To people who are not initiated to watching it, I mean, it can be quite horrifying at first.
Oh, it's hugely horrifying.
Yeah.
People,
but that's the appeal for someone like you. You like that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realise I enjoyed it until I got to about 40, and then suddenly it all made sense. But it can appear from the outside terrifically barbaric. But the more you watch, the more you observe it, the more you get to know what's going on. There's a great deal of nuance and complexity to it that is quite satisfying.
Well, a large part of the sport now is women's cage fighting.
Yeah.
And of course, I suppose that adds an element to this story, which is that she slapped him in this fight in a bar, and he slapped her back. I mean, I think there have been cage fights between men and women, have there not?
I think there was one, but it certainly wasn't sanctioned by the UFC.
It wasn't sanctioned by the UFC.
It's pretty awful. I think, I mean, in the debate that rages around people being able to change gender easily and compete, trans women competing in women's sport, I think that was kind of an outlier in that there was a man who was fairly successful or trans woman who was fairly successful in women's fighting.
Yeah.
So I don't think this can be put into that category.
But you don't watch? Do you watch the women's cage fighting?
It's a bit sporty for my tastes. I can't.
Raw.
I don't enjoy it particularly, seeing the women fighting.
But from an egalitarian perspective, you see that it's fair game.
I think if they want to fight, they're completely allowed to fight. A lot of them have come from terrifically difficult backgrounds. I mean, they're quite often poverty, and there are a fair few female UFC fighters who have been victims of domestic violence, and so it kind of makes it all the worse. It's not great.
Is Dana White going to lose his job, do you think?
Well, that's what's so fascinating. He is imposed. He's gone very quiet. He hasn't. He made a statement about it in a terrifically sympathetic interview with TMZ, who were the people that first released the footage. They didn't release the footage until they had a comment from him. They're kind of, they get great access to the UFC, and they have done traditionally. So they gave a very, very softball interview with him, saying, there was a lot of alcohol involved. Do you even remember it? It's just between you and your wife. He's apologised to her. He says she has released a statement saying that it's never happened before, which I suppose is very unfortunate. The first time it ever happened, it was caught on camera, and what are the chances? So that's where we are. The share price fell of the Endeavour Group, which owns the UFC. The share price fell in the days after it happened, a few percent, 5%. It hasn't seemed to have fallen too much further. And so maybe he will keep his job. He doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Can anybody remove him if he doesn't want to go?
Yes, because he is the president, but it is owned by the Endeavour Group. So the Endeavour Group presumably could get rid of him. I think he has an equity stake. Nobody knows what his equity stake is. I think originally it was about 9%, but then it got sold to the Endeavour Group, and he says they gave him a stake. Nobody really knows what it is. But yes, if public opinion turns sufficiently violently against him, I'm sure they could get rid of him. But they don't seem to be doing it.
I know UFC is global, but it's probably biggest in America. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's big in America, but it's massive in the Middle East. It's big in this country, huge in Russia, big throughout Europe. It's global.
But it is sort of connected to populism, isn't it? In that Donald Trump had connections with WWF, which is the fake wrestling. I shouldn't say that, probably get in big trouble for saying that, but the less real wrestling, let's say. And then Dana White was close to Trump. They knew,
Massively.
They know each other, they're pals.
Well, massively. And Donald Trump, I think in the early days of the UFC, he staged some fights in his hotels. So he got into it quite early. I don't know if he is a huge fan of it, but Dana White is certainly a very high-profile Trump supporter. As for populism, I don't know about that, but I do suspect that UFC fans and certainly UFC fighters tend towards the right. There's not too much. You certainly wouldn't say there's too much of the progressive nature to the UFC. There's no talking of pronouns or transgressions or microaggressions.
Yeah.
It's all a bit more fighty than that.
What do you say to people who have slightly maybe fogyish instincts like me, who think, when you sanction ultra-violence, when you turn it into entertainment, can you be that horrified that the head of it is a violent person?
I suppose the whole sport is built upon the idea of very controlled violence and regulated violence, and also martial arts are generally about self-defense or, I suppose, looking after people who are vulnerable. I suppose if you're great at fighting, but I think, having not done it myself, but I suspect the first thing martial artists learn is that you should never attack people who are vulnerable or unable to defend themselves adequately against you. I don't think it's okay to say that hitting your wife is all right because your job is head of the UFC.
Well, I suppose what I'm driving at is that it's odd that UFC is so big. It is a multi-billion-dollar business, as you say, and yet quite a lot of people know nothing about it. Whereas something like boxing, you would probably know who even if you're not interested at all, you'd probably know who Mike Tyson is. But there's probably large chunks of the population who don't know who Conor McGregor, say, is. I
don't know if that's true. Conor McGregor is the last, he's been out for a year, but before that he was the second or third highest paid athlete in the world, sort of just behind Ronaldo and LeBron James. He is massive. He's truly famous. But I agree, people don't know, the wider public probably don't follow cage fighting. I'm very, very surprised if many Spectator subscribers do, or Spectator readers, perhaps they do. But it's only been around since 2021, really, since Dana White. So in just 2 decades, it's grown phenomenally fast, and it shows no sign of slowing.
No one has ever died in the Octagon. Is it even called the Octagon anymore?
It's called the Octagon, yeah.
Yeah.
It's called the Octagon. No, I don't think anyone's died. Well, no, I know no one's died. People have probably sustained terrible injuries that have affected them later on. But it does always seem to be fairly injury-free, surprisingly injury-free, given what they do to each other.
Look, given that it is such a big world sport and so many people are interested in it, apart from your article, I have not seen much of a clamour for Dana White to go. Is that just because of the power he wields?
I think so. So I think that's extraordinary. There has been such a muted response from both the journalists who cover the sport and from the fighters to get rid of him. In fact, there's been the opposite. There are a great deal of fans, people have been commenting to me or sending me tweets beneath the article and across social media. You can see there is a strange number of people defending what Dana White has done.
There's a lot of suspicion that there's deep misogyny within UFC because it's sort of thought to be bro culture. People think Andrew Tate, the now notorious misogynist, is associated with it, although I believe he's more of a kickboxer he was more of a kickboxer and fighter. But Joe Rogan, the very famous podcaster, very bro-y podcaster, is a announcer, a commentator for UFC. And so a lot of people want to attack it as this misogynistic sport, even if there is a big women's part to it. And this story, as you say in your piece, gives succor to those people.
Massively. So I think previously the accusations of misogyny, or the general feeling of misogyny, was misplaced, or at least defendable against. There are certainly fighters within the UFC who have been caught up in domestic abuse troubles, and some of that is pretty bad. However, there is simply no way, now that the president of the entire show has been seen on camera doing it, to be able to say that it's free of misogyny or free of domestic violence. If the president of the whole organisation has done it without any sanction or repercussion, then the precedent it sets is unbelievable. There's any time in future one of the fighters does it, or somebody involved in the organisation does something similar, or in fact any fan or anyone who looks up to the fighters or to Dana White as a role model, which many people will do. What type of example is it setting?
So for you, as a Dana White fan, Dana must go.
Dana must certainly go. There's no two ways about it. It's unthinkable that he continues, I think.
But yet, here we are. We're how many days? 10 days?
10 days in, yeah.
Since the footage became public, and no movement.
And I think that in itself is interesting. We talk constantly about cancel culture and people being cancelled for all sorts of things. And yet, here we are. There's something terrible has happened. There's hard evidence it's happened. And yet, if you are sufficiently powerful and sufficiently able to just get your head down and try and batten down the hatches, then perhaps you can be immune to cancel culture for something which is obviously egregious.
Do you think it makes a difference that his wife appears to have forgiven him?
It must do. I mean, she could otherwise take him to court or have him arrested for it, so it makes a huge difference. And I suppose maybe it provokes a wider debate about how much really does this stuff go on, and does the typical UFC fan think, well, there but for the grace of God, or it's how unusual is domestic violence or amongst UFC fans? How unusual is it generally? I don't know. It's
well, people keep saying we're living through an epidemic of violence against women. I tend to be sceptical about that. I think there's always been violence against women. I don't think it's particularly stronger now than it has been. If anything, I'd say it's weaker. But I take your point that this incident doesn't help the UFC on that front.
Well, it doesn't help the UFC at all, but it also is instructive, the amount of people who have taken to public forums and social media to defend it. I mean, that seems amazing. There are other, there are other crimes which society puts on the same level as hitting a woman if you're a man, and it seems unimaginable that people would defend those publicly if they.
Are you just talking about? Camera. Are you just talking about people on social media defending him, or are you talking about leading figures within the sport saying?
Yes. Well, there are fighters who have come out and said she hit him first and it's kind of okay. But there's also a complete lack of, well, not a complete, but a huge lack of the sports journalists taking a stance against it. And that's because if Dana was to survive the scandal, which he looks more and more like doing, then he will still be in position and he will have complete say over how they progress in their careers. There's a journalist called Ariel Helwani who every year since 2010 has won the MMA's leading or best journalist. And in 2016 he transgressed Dana White, and I think he broke an embargo on a story, but it was kind of a ridiculous embargo about a fighter returning to the UFC. And he'd also questioned or raised questions about the amount of money the fighters are paid, which is often kind of scandalous how little they get paid. And as a result, Dana White issued a lifetime ban for him. He was working for ESPN, so he couldn't attend any UFC conferences. It was subsequently lifted, but it showed the power he had. With that ban in place, he was completely unable to do his job.
Well, that's often when the interest I've taken in UFC, limited as it is, that's often what I thought, is that the fighting's very real, but everything around it seems quite fake. And Dana White sort of pulls all the strings The press conferences are clearly orchestrated by him. Who fights who is clearly chosen by him. It's sort of WWF outside the ring, isn't it?
I disagree with that because I think the tagline of UFC is as real as it gets. That's what the whole thing is. It's meant to be very real.
Yeah.
And obviously the WWE or whatever F is complete pantomime. But this isn't. The characters within it seem cartoonish, and they are cartoonish, but they seem to be blissfully free of society's norms. They fight for a living. They can do and say largely whatever they like because they're not hidebound by any sort of
cancel culture
or constraints of politeness or whatever. What they're doing is beyond that, and they are larger than life in every way. But often, many of them are sort of fundamentally very good people. And so it's kind of disgusting to see that the guy who's in charge of the whole thing is obviously cut from a slightly different cloth. In terms of the fights and putting the fights together, it is far more honest as a sport than, say, boxing, where box fighters avoid each other for years on end. Whereas in the UFC, they're put together, the best fight's the best, and it's constant. So it's always incredibly exciting.
You are clearly quite passionate about the idea that Dana has to go. Will you keep campaigning on this issue if he does not?
Well, I don't know what else is there to write. I mean, I've said he should go. He's not going. I don't know. Yes, I probably would. It'd be hard to see him in a UFC fight. He comes out and puts the belt around the winners, and it's hard. It'd be hard not to have to think badly of him every time you see him now. That man hits women. It leaves a nasty taste in the mouth, I guess.
He also pushes them apart, doesn't he? When fighters, when they do the squaring up thing, he loves stepping in the middle and doing that. Yeah. And most people will think of because most people who are interested have now seen the video of him.
I guess also, there's an aspect of it as well. The legacy that anybody has, he's built. It's rather sad. He's built a multi-billion-dollar industry, kind of out of nothing. And that's an amazing achievement. He's taken it international, he's got it televised, all these other amazing things. But ultimately, the thing he will now be remembered for will be this footage. You can't, if you hit a woman in public, there's no raising that from everybody's minds. And I don't see how it's not just ignoring it isn't going to make it go away.
Well, Damian, thank you very much for coming into the Spectator's Octagon, the view from 22.
Thank you.
And please come on again.